The kitchen light came on at 5:47 a.m. Nobody asked Emily to turn it on. Nobody had ever asked. It was simply one of the 100 things that happened because she made them happen, silent and automatic, the way a house breathes without anyone noticing the air. She stood at the counter in the gray morning and looked at the coffee maker she'd refilled the night before, and the medications she'd already sorted into the weekly pill organizer, and the permission slip on the refrigerator that needed a signature before 8 a.m. and thought, Tuesday. Just that Tuesday. She didn't think about what she wanted from the day. She hadn't done that in a long time. She started the coffee. She pulled the pill organizer from the shelf, the one she'd bought at the pharmacy 3 years ago, the one with the days of the week printed in blue letters that had begun to fade on the W and the T, and she set it on the tray beside a glass of water, the way she did every morning, the way Frank needed it done because he wouldn't remember otherwise. Frank was her father-in-law. He was 74 and had mild cognitive decline and a heart condition that required 4 medications at precise intervals, and he had lived with them for 6 years. And in 6 years, he had never once learned where the pill organizer was kept without being shown. She didn't resent him for it. That was the thing people wouldn't understand if she tried to explain it. She didn't resent any of them. She loved them. She had simply been loving them for so long, and in such a specific and practical and unwitnessed way, that the love had become invisible even to her, folded into the fabric of the days until it was indistinguishable from the days themselves. She cracked 4 eggs into a bowl, listened to the house. David was still asleep. He wouldn't be up for another 40 minutes, and when he came down he would go straight to the coffee she'd made and drink it standing at the counter reading something on his phone. And he would say either nothing or something about traffic or work. And then he would put the cup in the sink, not the dishwasher, the sink, always the sink, in the way of a man who has never once considered who empties the sink, and he would leave. Lucas was 17. He slept until she called him twice, sometimes 3 times, and came down in the particular fog of teenage mornings with his backpack slung on one shoulder and ate whatever was on the table and left without looking up from his phone. He was a good kid. She believed that completely. He was simply 17, which meant the world outside his own experience had not yet come into focus. And Frank would be up at 7, shuffling down the hallway in his slippers, and he would look for the pill organizer in the same place he looked every morning, the wrong place, the counter by the microwave, before she redirected him. And he would eat his oatmeal and thank her in the distracted way of someone who receives a service they no longer consciously register as a service. She whisked the eggs. She thought briefly and without particular emotion that she had not eaten breakfast herself in 11 days. Not because there wasn't food. Because by the time everyone else was fed and out the door, the window for sitting down had closed, and she was already on to the next thing, and hunger had become something she managed in the margins of other tasks. A piece of toast standing at the counter, a handful of crackers at noon. She didn't flag this as a problem. That, too, was something people wouldn't understand. She had been Emily Carter for 15 years. Before that, and this was a fact that existed now mostly in her own memory and in a box of documents in the closet of the second bedroom, she had been Emily Marsh, who had worked at a marketing consultancy in Portland and had been, by any reasonable measure, good at it. She had managed accounts. She had led a team of 6. She had once given a presentation to a client's board of directors that her supervisor had described as the best he'd seen from someone at her level. She had met David at a conference. He was in finance. He was confident and funny and paid attention to her in the particular way of someone who recognized something worth recognizing. They had dated for 2 years. She had moved to Seattle for him, which had felt like a choice at the time, and which she understood now as the first in a series of small surrenders so gradual they had each felt like love. Lucas was born 18 months after the wedding. She had taken maternity leave. David's father had suffered a mild stroke the following year and required more care than had been expected, and they had made a practical decision, practical, that was the word they'd used, that it made more sense for Emily to stay home. Just for a while, until things stabilized. Things had stabilized. She had not gone back. She could not pinpoint the exact moment when just for a while had become, this is your life now. That was the particular cruelty of gradual things. They didn't announce themselves. She slid the eggs onto a plate, cut the toast, poured the orange juice. From upstairs, she heard David's alarm go off, then the sound of him silencing it. She set his coffee on the counter and went to the bottom of the stairs. Lucas, she called, 20 minutes. A muffled sound from behind a closed door. She went back to the kitchen. The morning proceeded the way mornings proceeded. David came down and drank his coffee and said the Hendersons' dog had gotten into the trash again. She nodded and asked if she'd called the plumber about the downstairs bathroom. She had. 2 days ago, she reminded him the appointment was Thursday and put his cup in the sink and left. Lucas came down and ate without sitting, which she had given up asking him about, and grabbed his bag. And she said permission slip, and he said, "Oh, right," and took it from the refrigerator and left. Frank came down at 7 and looked for the pill organizer by the microwave, and she redirected him, and he sat at the table and ate his oatmeal and said, "Good oatmeal," without looking up. She cleared the table. She loaded the dishwasher. She found a single sock under Lucas's chair that had apparently been there since Sunday. She put a load of laundry in. She wiped the counters. She went to the bathroom cabinet and noted that David was nearly out of the specific razor blades he preferred and added it to the list on her phone, the ongoing list, currently at 14 items, that she maintained in the same app she used for grocery lists, because there was no meaningful distinction between those categories of maintenance anymore. Then she sat down at the kitchen table. For a moment, the house was completely quiet. She looked at the chair across from her, where David had been standing, at the empty counter where Lucas had eaten, at the table where Frank had sat, at the kitchen she had cleaned and organized and stocked and maintained for 15 years, the kitchen that appeared to run itself because she had made it appear that way. She thought, when did I last sit here? She couldn't remember. She thought, when did someone last ask me what I wanted for breakfast? She knew the answer to that one. Never. Not that they were cruel. She needed that to be understood. They were not cruel people. David loved her in the way that people love things they have stopped seeing, completely, in theory, and barely at all in practice. Lucas loved her with the uncomplicated totality of a child who has never once had to consider whether the person taking care of him might need taking care of. Frank was grateful in the absent way of someone for whom gratitude had become too familiar to feel. They needed her. She had spent 15 years mistaking need for love. She stood up before she could sit with that thought too long. She had things to do. She always had things to do. The dinner party was David's idea. He mentioned it on a Wednesday with the casual certainty of a man who has never once organized a dinner party in his life, and therefore has no mechanism for understanding what organizing one involves. "The Marchettis are in town this weekend," he said. "I told them to come Saturday, 6-ish. Emily was folding laundry. "How many people?" she said. 6, 7 maybe, nothing fancy." She looked at him. He was looking at his phone. "David," she said, "Saturday is 4 days away." "I know, it's not a big deal. You always pull these things off." He set his phone down and looked up with the smile he used when he was handing her a problem he wanted her to solve. "You're amazing at this." She turned back to the laundry. "You're amazing at this." She had learned over years of translation that what this meant was, "I have committed us to something without consulting you, and I need you to not make it a problem." The compliment was not a compliment. It was a mechanism. She said nothing. Saturday came. She had spent 4 days in the functional background of the preparation, the grocery trips, the menu planning, the cleaning, the ironing of the tablecloth that lived in the hall closet and which David did not know existed, the preparation of 2 dishes the night before, the arrangement of the table. Lucas had been asked to tidy his room in case anyone needed to use the upstairs bathroom. He had done a version of this. The Marchettis arrived. Also the Hendersons and a couple Emily didn't know named the Warfields, who were friends of David's from work. 8 people total, not 6 or 7. Emily had made enough food for 10. She moved between the kitchen and the dining room for 2 hours. She refilled glasses. She redirected a conversation that was heading somewhere awkward. She cut Frank's food without drawing attention to it. She laughed at the right moments and asked the right questions and kept the room comfortable in the invisible way of someone who is very good at something no one is watching. At some point, the conversation turned to work. David was talking about a deal his firm had recently closed. The Warfields were asking questions. The energy at the table had the particular quality that it got when David was holding court. Something he did well, something she had once genuinely admired. "Emily used to work too back before," someone said. She thought it was Marchetti's wife. She couldn't be sure. David looked up. He smiled. "She stays home now," he said, casual, definitive. "Honestly, between the house and Dad and Lucas, it's basically a full-time job." He looked at her briefly, a kind of public acknowledgement. "She manages everything. She manages everything." She stood at the edge of the table with a serving dish in her hands and looked at him and understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with surprise, what had just happened. Not cruelty, not malice. A simple, unremarkable act of erasure. She had been a person with a career and a competency and an identity that had nothing to do with this house. And he had summarized 15 years in one sentence. And the sentence was, "She stays home now." She set the serving dish down. She smiled at something Margaret Warfield was saying. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the sink and looked at the window above it, which reflected the kitchen back at her in the dark glass. The room lit up behind her, the voices and the laughter, and her own face looking back from the outside of all of it. She thought, "I used to give presentations to boardrooms." She turned on the faucet and washed her hands and went back out. The last guests left at 11. She cleaned while David said goodbye at the door. She loaded the dishwasher. She covered the leftovers. She wiped the table and the counters and took the recycling to the bin outside in the cold because it was full, and if she didn't do it now, it would be full in the morning. She came back inside. David was already heading upstairs. He paused at the bottom of the staircase with the particular vagueness of someone who has had a good evening and is now thinking about sleep. "Great night," he said. "Yes," she said. "The food was incredible, seriously." He looked at her with genuine appreciation. She could see it was genuine, which was almost worse than if it wasn't. "You outdid yourself." She said thank you. He went upstairs. She stood in the dining room and looked at the table. At the tablecloth she had ironed on Thursday morning. At the centerpiece she had put together from things she'd found in the backyard. At the chairs pushed back at irregular angles by people who had eaten well and laughed and gone home. She turned off the dining room light. She went to the kitchen. She sat down at the table in the dark. The house was completely quiet. David was upstairs. Lucas was in his room with his headphones on. Frank was asleep by 9:30, as he always was. The house that she ran and maintained and organized and made livable for 4 people sat around her in the silence that always came after the evenings ended. Nobody had asked how she was. Not once. Not during dinner, not in passing, not in the brief moment when David had paused at the stairs and looked at her with what she'd recognized as genuine affection. You outdid yourself. She was not a person tonight. She had been a function. An excellent function, she would grant herself that. In the dark and the quiet, she would grant herself that, but a function nonetheless. Something that produced results, and when the results were good, was briefly appreciated, and when the results were absorbed and the evening was over, was not thought about again. She sat with this for a long time. She was not crying, she noticed that. She was past the kind of hurt that produces tears. She was in a different country now, one that she had been traveling toward for years without a map. And the terrain here was flat and gray and very quiet, and she sat in the kitchen at midnight and understood, perhaps for the first time with this particular clarity, that she had disappeared. Not physically, not in any way anyone would notice. She had disappeared in the way that people disappear when no one is watching them anymore, when they have been needed for so long that their needness has become their entire identity. When the question, "How are you?" has not been directed at them in so long that they would not know how to answer it. She put her head down on the table. Just for a moment. The kitchen was dark and the house was quiet, and nobody came. After a while, she got up and went to bed. Tomorrow was Wednesday. There were things to do. The migraines had started in March. She hadn't told anyone. This was not a decision so much as a habit, the habit of a woman who had learned, through long practice, that mentioning her own discomfort created more work than absorbing it quietly. If she said her head hurt, someone would ask if she'd taken anything, and she would say yes, and that would be the end of the conversation, and she would still have the migraine and also now the conversation to manage. So she said nothing. She kept 2 bottles of ibuprofen, one in the kitchen cabinet behind the vitamins, one in her car. She had developed a precise internal calibration for the onset of a migraine, the particular quality of pressure behind her left eye that preceded the real pain by about 40 minutes. And when she felt it, she took the ibuprofen early enough that she could usually continue functioning through the worst of it. Usually, on a Thursday in October, she was standing in the school pickup line when the 40-minute window closed without her having reached the ibuprofen in time. The pain arrived in the particular way it sometimes did when she'd been late, not gradually, but all at once. A tightening behind her eyes that contracted her entire field of vision to a narrow and effortful channel. She sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes after Lucas got in the car. "Why aren't we moving?" he asked. "Just waiting for traffic to clear," she said. He put his headphones on. She sat behind the wheel with both hands in her lap and breathed carefully and waited for the worst of it to pass and thought about the fact that she had a load of laundry in the dryer, Frank's prescription to pick up, and dinner to start by 5 if it was going to be ready by 6:30. The pain didn't pass. She drove home anyway. The days had a weight to them now that she could feel in a physical way she hadn't been able to before. Not tiredness exactly. She had been tired for years, and tiredness had become so baseline that she no longer registered it as a state. This was different. This was the feeling of a structure bearing more load than it was designed for. Small compressions accumulating in places that didn't show. She woke up at night sometimes with her heart beating at a frequency that felt wrong. She'd lie still in the dark beside David, who slept easily and well, and she would breathe through it and wait for it to pass and think about the next day, the appointments, the tasks, the invisible machinery that needed tending. And eventually she would sleep again. On a Tuesday, she nearly fainted in the car. She was pulling out of the pharmacy parking lot, Frank's medications in a bag on the passenger seat. When the edges of her vision began to gray in the particular way she recognized now as her body's way of announcing that it had reached a limit she'd been ignoring. She pulled back into the parking space and sat with the engine running and her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes. A woman knocked on her window. "Are you okay?" The woman was about 60, in a yellow coat, leaning down with the concerned expression of a stranger who has decided not to walk past. Emily opened her eyes. "Fine," she said, "just a headache." The woman looked at her for a moment longer than the answer warranted. "You sure?" "Yes, thank you." The woman walked on. Emily sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes by the clock on the dashboard. She thought about calling David. She didn't call David. She thought about what she would say and how he would respond. The concern, immediate and genuine and brief, followed by the question of what was for dinner. Not from cruelty, but from the particular blindness of a person who has never once had to consider whether the household would continue without them. And she decided that the energy required by the conversation was not energy she had. She drove home. She started dinner at 5. That evening, Frank couldn't find his reading glasses. This was not unusual. Frank's reading glasses migrated through the house in a pattern that defied geometry. They turned up in the bathroom, in the garden, once inexplicably in the freezer, and finding them was a task that had become so routine that she did it automatically, the way she did most things, without stopping to consider that it was a task that should not, by any reasonable accounting, be hers. She found them on the bookshelf in the living room behind a photograph of David's parents from the 1980s. She brought them to Frank. He took them without looking up from the television. "Thank you," he said. The thank you of someone acknowledging a process rather than a person. She went back to the kitchen. Lucas came in at 8 for food, despite the fact that dinner had been at 6:30, because he'd decided he was hungry again. And she made him a sandwich because it was faster than the conversation about making his own. And he took it upstairs without saying thank you. And she stood at the counter and looked at the sink and felt, very quietly, a door somewhere inside her swing slightly further open than it had before. Not anger, something more tired than anger. She thought about what it would take for any of them to understand what was happening to her. She ran through the options the way she'd run through them before, late at night in the kitchen, and arrived at the same conclusion. There was no version of explaining it that they would absorb in the way that it needed to be absorbed. David would apologize and mean it and change for a week. Lucas would feel guilty and uncomfortable. Frank would not fully understand. And within a month, possibly 2, the machinery would have returned to its original settings because the original settings were all any of them knew. You couldn't fix a thing people didn't know was broken. She turned off the kitchen light. She went to bed early. She lay in the dark and thought, how much longer? It wasn't a question anymore. It was a measurement. The collapse happened on a Friday morning. There was nothing dramatic in the lead-up. No particular event, no escalation beyond the ordinary accumulation of ordinary days. It was simply a Friday, and she had been up since before 6. And she had made breakfast and managed Frank's medications and found Lucas's other shoe under the hallway bench, and signed a form David had left on the counter with a sticky note that said PLS signed TA checks, and packed the dishwasher from the night before because she'd been too tired to do it the previous evening. And she was standing at the stove making oatmeal. And then she was on the floor. She didn't experience it as a fall. There was no moment of deciding. The floor was simply where she was, suddenly, with the particular disorientation of someone whose body has made a decision that bypassed their awareness entirely. The stove was above her. The cabinet handles, the fluorescent light. She lay still for a moment. The oatmeal was bubbling. She could hear it. She thought the oatmeal. She tried to get up and found that getting up required more than she had. She made it to sitting, stayed there. The kitchen moved in a slow way around the fixed point of the cabinet she was leaning against, and she pressed her back against it and breathed and looked at the oatmeal and thought about the fact that Frank would be up in 20 minutes. David found her. He had come down early, some conference call, some reason she didn't track, and he came into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. Emily, he was beside her immediately. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard in a long time, stripped, all the distraction gone. "Emily, what happened?" "I'm fine," she said, automatic. "You're on the floor." "I know, I just... Don't." He sat down on the floor beside her, which she registered with a dim surprise, David Carter in his work clothes, sitting on the kitchen floor. And he put his hand on her face and looked at her the way he used to look at her, a long time ago. "Don't tell me you're fine, look at me." She looked at him. Whatever he saw made him reach for his phone. The doctor's name was Chen. She was Emily's GP, which meant she had Emily's records, which meant that when she reviewed them in the context of the symptoms David described on the phone, she said to come in immediately. Emily sat in the waiting room in the clothes she'd been wearing when she fell, the soft pants and the old pullover she wore for mornings, the ones she changed out of before anyone came home in the evenings. She hadn't had time to change. David was beside her, present in a way that felt strange after so long, his knee nearly touching hers. He hadn't left her side since the kitchen floor. She noticed this without knowing what to do with it. Dr. Chen was thorough and unhurried, and had the quality of a physician who listens in a way that goes beyond the clinical. She took Emily's blood pressure twice. She asked questions. Emily answered them, and in answering them heard herself say things she had not said aloud before: the migraines, the frequency, the near fainting in the pharmacy parking lot, the sleep interruptions, the way she had been eating, the general architecture of her days. David sat in the chair in the corner of the examination room. He was very still. Dr. Chen made notes. She looked up. "Emily," she said, with the measured directness of someone who has decided that kindness requires honesty, "what you're describing is consistent with severe burnout and stress-related physical decompensation. Your blood pressure is elevated in a way that concerns me. The fainting episode today was likely vasovagal, triggered by prolonged physical and emotional strain." She paused. "This is your body telling you that it cannot continue at the current level of output without consequences." The room was quiet. "What does that mean?" David asked. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who is beginning to understand the size of something he should have seen sooner. Dr. Chen looked at him and then back at Emily. "It means that rest is not optional at this point. It means that the conditions that produced this," she gestured, a small, careful gesture, "need to change, structurally, not temporarily." Emily looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about the oatmeal, whether anyone had turned it off. "I'm going to refer you to a cardiologist for a follow-up on the blood pressure," Dr. Chen said. "And I want to see you back in 2 weeks. But Emily," she waited until Emily looked up, "I need you to hear me when I say this isn't a warning. This is what comes after warnings." Emily nodded. She heard it. She wasn't sure it changed anything. She didn't know yet what the shape of change looked like from inside a life that had been the same shape for 15 years. David drove her home. He didn't speak for most of the drive. She watched the streets go past, the suburban Seattle November, gray and damp and familiar, and thought about nothing in particular, the way you think about nothing when you are too tired for thoughts to form. He pulled into the driveway. "Emily," he said. She looked at him. His hands were still on the steering wheel. He was looking straight ahead at the garage door. "I didn't know," he said. She considered this. "I know," she said. It was not forgiveness. It was not an absolution. It was simply the truth. He hadn't known. He hadn't known because he hadn't looked. He hadn't looked because she had always managed everything in the space before it became visible, and in that way she had made herself invisible, and she understood now that she had participated in her own erasure. She got out of the car. Inside, Frank was sitting at the kitchen table with a bowl of oatmeal someone had turned off and covered with a plate. He looked up when she came in. "There you are," he said. "I wasn't sure what happened to breakfast." She looked at the covered bowl. She looked at the kitchen, the cleared counters, the loaded dishwasher, the signs of a morning she'd managed before it managed her. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Mom, her mother's name. Her actual mother, Margaret Marsh, 71 years old, widowed, living alone in Tacoma in the house where Emily had grown up. A woman who called on Sundays and sometimes Wednesdays, and who Emily had been meaning to visit for 3 months without finding the window. She answered. "Emily," Her mother's voice had a quality she recognized immediately, the particular tone of someone trying not to alarm. "I don't want to worry you, but I had a little fall yesterday. I'm fine, I want to say that first. But the doctor thinks I should have someone around for a bit, and I—" A pause. "I know you're busy, I know you have the house and David and Frank, but I didn't know who else to call." Emily stood in the kitchen with the phone to her ear and looked at the covered bowl of oatmeal. She thought about Dr. Chen's voice. This is what comes after warnings. She thought about the kitchen floor, about the pharmacy parking lot, about March and the migraines and the 11 days without breakfast and the laundry and the razor blades on the list and the permission slips and the pill organizers and the reading glasses and the 4 people who had called her name 10,000 times and each time had meant, "I need something." She thought about her mother's voice, saying I didn't know who else to call. Someone who needed her because she was her daughter, not because she was a function. "I'll come," Emily said. Her own voice surprised her. Not hesitant, not apologetic, simply certain in the way of a person who has just recognized the only clear thing in a complicated room. "You will?" Her mother sounded surprised too. "Yes," Emily said. "I'll be there tomorrow." She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she went upstairs to pack a bag. She left on a Saturday morning. The bag she packed was not large. That was the thing David noticed first. Not her absence, not the fact of her going, but the smallness of the bag. A rolling carry-on and a tote. 15 years in this house, and she was leaving with a carry-on and a tote, and something about that proportion disturbed him in a way he couldn't immediately name. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom and watched her zip the bag. "I don't know how long," she said. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't asking permission. She was simply stating the facts in the manner of someone who has decided that facts are all she has energy for. "Mom needs help while she recovers. It could be a week, could be more." "Of course," David said. "Take the time you need." He said it easily. She noticed the ease of it. The ease of a man who had never once had to calculate whether he could be spared. She lifted the bag from the bed. "Frank's medications are in the organizer through next Friday," she said. "I've labeled each day. The instructions are on the refrigerator. There's a sheet. It covers his diet restrictions and the timing for the heart medication. Dr. Patel's number is there too in case anything changes." She paused. "Lucas has a history paper due Wednesday. He knows about it, but he'll need reminding Tuesday night. There's food in the freezer. I've labeled everything. It just needs to be heated." David was nodding. The nod of someone receiving a briefing they believe they understand. "Emily," he said her name with a seriousness that was genuine. "I've got it." She looked at him. She thought about saying, "You don't know what you've got. You don't know the scope of it. You have never once stood in the place where I stand and looked at what has to be managed by tomorrow morning. You think you've got it because you've never had to have it before, and so you have no scale for what having it means." She didn't say any of it. "Okay," she said. She kissed him. A brief, familiar kiss, the kind that had become so habitual it had lost its original meaning and become something else, a kind of punctuation, a mark at the end of a sentence neither of them was fully reading anymore. She said goodbye to Frank, who patted her hand and said to give her mother his regards. She knocked on Lucas's door. He was awake, barely, hair flattened on one side, and he hugged her with the slightly surprised warmth of a teenager who doesn't expect to be moved and finds himself moved anyway. "Call if you need anything," he said, which was what she usually said to him, and something in the reversal of it caught in her chest. "I will," she said. She walked down the stairs. She walked through the kitchen she had run for 15 years. The kitchen with the pill organizer and the labeled freezer meals, and the instruction sheet on the refrigerator, and the list of 14 items still in her phone. And she opened the back door. She stood on the threshold for a moment. The November air was cold and clean and smelled of wet leaves and someone's wood fire a few houses down. The backyard was gray in the early light. The garden beds she maintained were putting themselves to sleep for winter, the way they did every year. She stepped outside. She pulled the door closed behind her. She stood at her car in the driveway for a moment with her hand on the door handle and breathed the cold air and felt, underneath the tiredness and the residual ache behind her eyes, something she identified slowly and with some surprise as relief. Not happiness. Relief was different from happiness. Relief was what came when a weight had been carried for so long that the person carrying it had forgotten it was a weight, and then for one moment they were allowed to set it down. She set it down. She got in the car and drove south toward Tacoma, and did not look in the rearview mirror. David made coffee. This was the first task, and he accomplished it without difficulty, because making coffee was one of the things he did every morning. Or rather, it was one of the things he retrieved every morning. The distinction, which he did not yet understand, was that Emily had filled the machine the night before and set the timer. He drank the coffee standing at the counter, the way he always did, and read something on his phone and thought that this was manageable. He thought Emily needed a break. It was good that she was taking one. He would handle things here. It was not complicated. By 9 a.m., Frank was up. David knew about the medications. He had been told about the medications. He went to the organizer on the shelf. He found it on the second try and brought it to Frank with a glass of water. "This the right one?" he asked. Frank looked at it. "She usually checks," he said. "I know, I'm checking." Frank looked at the pills. "She checks against the sheet." David looked at Frank. "What sheet?" "The sheet on the refrigerator." David went to the refrigerator. There was a sheet, 2 pages actually, printed in Emily's small, neat handwriting, organized by time of day and medication name and whether it needed to be taken with food. He read it. He cross-referenced the organizer. He returned to Frank. The process had taken 9 minutes. He thought about how long it had taken Emily. He didn't finish the thought. By Sunday evening, the kitchen had acquired a quality it did not usually have. Confusion. Not mess exactly. David was not a messy person. But there was a particular kind of disorder that was worse than mess, which was the disorder of things being in the wrong places because the person who knew where things belonged was not there. The colander was on the wrong shelf. The recycling hadn't been sorted. The laundry he'd started that morning was still in the washing machine because he had forgotten about it and now would need to be run again. He made pasta for dinner. This went reasonably well. He found the pasta. He found the pot. He used the wrong amount of water, but it didn't matter. He made a sauce from a jar because the alternative was asking where things were in his own kitchen. A question he found he could not quite bring himself to ask, because it required acknowledging something he wasn't ready to acknowledge. He called Emily. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the quality of someone in a different house, a different register. "Hey, how's your mom?" "Doing okay, she's tired. We had a good afternoon." "Good," a pause. "I made pasta." "Okay." He waited for her to say something else. She didn't. "The kids ate," he said. Frank seemed fine. "Good." He stood in the kitchen with the phone to his ear and looked at the colander on the wrong shelf and thought, "She's not going to ask. She's not going to ask how I'm managing or whether there are problems or whether I need anything." He understood, with a dim and uncomfortable clarity, that he had asked those questions exactly never times in 15 years. "Get some rest," he said. "I will," she said. "Good night, David." She hung up. He stood in the kitchen. He looked around. He thought, "I've got this." He almost believed it. Monday was the first full day. He got up at 6:30, which was later than Emily got up, a fact he was not aware of. He started the coffee and found that the machine needed to be filled, the beans, the water. And by the time he'd figured out the bean grinder, it was 6:50 and Frank was already at the kitchen door in his slippers looking for his pill organizer. "It's on the shelf," David said. "Which shelf?" David pointed. Frank squinted. "She keeps it on the tray." "It's the same organizer." "She puts it on the tray," Frank said, with the patient inflexibility of an elderly man whose routines have become the architecture of his cognitive stability. "With the water already there." David found a tray. He found a glass. He filled the glass. He put the organizer on the tray. He brought it to Frank. Frank sat down and looked at it. "You warmed the oatmeal." David turned back to the stove. Lucas came down at 7:20, which was late. But David didn't know it was late because he had never once managed the morning timeline. Lucas looked at the counter and said, "What's for breakfast?" And David said, "Oatmeal should be ready soon." And Lucas looked at the stove and said, "It's not on." And David turned the burner on, and the oatmeal took 12 minutes, and Lucas left at 7:41, which David would later learn was 6 minutes after the bus. He drove Lucas to school. He was 40 minutes late to his own first meeting. By Wednesday, he had developed a new relationship with the refrigerator. He stood in front of it with the specific paralysis of a person who has always believed they know where things are and has discovered they do not. He knew the beer. He knew the leftover pasta. He did not know where Emily kept the things she used, the specific yogurt Frank needed, the lunch items Lucas expected, the components of the dinners that had simply appeared on the table for 15 years as if produced by the house itself. He called her on Wednesday evening. "Where do you keep the—" He looked at the list he'd written. "Frank needs the low-sodium broth, the doctor's thing, I can't find it." "Second shelf of the pantry," she said. Behind the canned tomatoes. Got it, he found it. Also, Lucas says his gym clothes need washing. Where's the hamper in his room? Delicate cycle, cold water, don't put it in the dryer. He wrote this down. Emily, he said. Yes. How many things are there that you do per week? A pause. Not a surprised pause. The pause of someone who has waited a long time for a question and is now deciding how to answer it. I counted once, she said. About 2 years ago, I stopped counting at 112. He was quiet. Things like what? He asked. Things like knowing that Frank's broth is behind the canned tomatoes. Things like knowing Lucas's gym clothes can't go in the dryer. Things like knowing the bus comes at 7:35 and that if you let him sleep until 7:20, he will miss it. She paused. Things like knowing that the coffee machine needs to be filled the night before if you want it ready at 6. He looked at the coffee machine. I didn't know, he said, for the second time in a week. I know, she said, for the second time in a week. The difference this time was that it landed differently for both of them. The school event was Thursday. He found out about it on Wednesday night, when Lucas mentioned it in the passing, distracted way of a teenager who has assumed the relevant adult already knows. The way he had assumed every time that Emily already knew. The junior showcase is tomorrow, Lucas said. He was eating cereal at 9 p.m. at the counter. I'm in the engineering section. It starts at 7. David looked up from his laptop. 7 a.m. 7 p.m. Lucas looked at him. Did Mom not put it on the calendar? David went to the kitchen calendar, the physical one on the wall, which Emily maintained in a handwriting he had never once looked at closely enough to read, and found it. Thursday, 7 p.m. Lucas showcase, bring camera. Underlined. He had not looked at the calendar once since Emily left. I'll be there, David said. Thursday at 6:45 he was on a call that ran long. He had not built in transition time because he had never had to build in transition time, because Emily had always managed the buffer zones, the advance preparations, the 10 minutes before logistics that kept a family running on schedule. He arrived at the school at 7:38. Lucas's section had presented at 7:15. He found Lucas in the corridor afterward, standing with 2 friends, his project board propped against the wall. The project was good. David could see that even now, looking at it quickly. The kind of careful, thorough work that Lucas had always done quietly and without fanfare. Lucas saw him. His face did the thing that a teenager's face does when they are disappointed and have decided to absorb it. A brief and very controlled flattening. There and gone. You missed it, Lucas said. I know, I'm sorry, the call ran. It's fine. It was not fine. They both knew it was not fine. But Lucas was 17 and had learned from watching, David understood now, from watching his mother absorb things without protest, that saying it's fine was easier than the alternative. They drove home in a silence that had a specific texture to it. Not hostile, something more complex than hostility. The silence of a person recalibrating. At a red light, Lucas said, Mom would have been there. David kept his eyes on the road. I know. Another silence. She always knew about everything, Lucas said, not an accusation. An observation being made for the first time, the way you make observations about things you've taken as given until the given is removed. Every event, every deadline, she just always knew. She did, David said. Lucas looked out the window. Why didn't you ever help her? He asked. The question was quiet, not angry. The honest question of a 17-year-old who has just begun to see the shape of something he should have seen a long time ago. David didn't answer immediately. The light changed. He drove through the intersection and thought about the question, the simple, clean, devastating accuracy of it, and found that he had no answer that was adequate. Not one that could be said in a car at a red light. Not one that could be said in a sentence. I don't know, he said finally. It was the most honest thing he'd said in a long time. Lucas nodded. Once. The nod of someone who has received an answer they expected and are not sure what to do with it yet. They drove the rest of the way home in silence. Inside, Frank was at the kitchen table with the television on and the pill organizer open, looking for his evening medication, which David had forgotten to set out. David sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface. He sat there for a long time. The house was quiet in the way it had been quiet since Saturday morning. Not the comfortable quiet of a house at rest, but the particular quiet of an absence. Emily's absence had a shape he was only now beginning to be able to see. It was in the unwashed laundry and the missed bus and the showcase he'd been 40 minutes late to. It was in the broth behind the canned tomatoes and the tray with the water glass and the calendar he hadn't read. It was in his son's voice, asking why he had never helped her. He reached for his phone. He started to call Emily. Then he stopped. He put the phone down. He thought, I have been calling her all week to ask where things are. Every call has been about what I need. He thought about the shape of that, and about the question Lucas had asked, and about the 43 pages of Emily's life he had apparently been reading in a foreign language for 15 years. He did not call. Instead, he went upstairs. He was looking for something specific. He wasn't sure what until he found it. On Emily's side of the closet, on the shelf above her clothes, between a box of photographs and a small wicker basket, was a notebook, navy blue. The cover worn at the corners in the way of something that had been handled often. He held it for a moment. He thought about opening it. He put it back. Not tonight, he thought. Tonight he needed to sit with the question his son had asked him, and the silence in the house, and the calendar on the kitchen wall with its careful handwriting, and the fact that the oatmeal took 9 minutes, and he had never once known that. Tonight he needed to stay in the discomfort long enough to understand it. He went back downstairs. He set out Frank's evening medication on the tray with the water glass. He didn't do it perfectly. He checked the sheet twice. It took longer than it should have. But he did it.